Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Leibowitz. With us today is Jack Lloyd, and he's here to debate objectivism versus libertarian voluntarism. This debate came about because I made a post on social media that said objectivism offers the best defense of capitalism. He took exception, so here we are today. Jack, welcome back to the show.
Hey, it's my pleasure, Michael. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm excited for this discussion. I think it's gonna be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think so too. So we've decided to, so as not to make this too onerous, is we're going to take one side of the debate at a time. First, Jack is going to give an opening statement as to why libertarian voluntarism offers the best defense of capitalism. We'll debate that for a half hour, 45 minutes. And then we'll switch it up. I'll give my opening statement for why objectivism offers the best defense of capitalism, and then we'll debate that for another 30 to 45 minutes. So with that said, I'm ready to go, Jack. So go ahead, give it your best.
Sure. No, I appreciate you having me on and having this discussion with me. Obviously, for those who are coming to the table and they have this idea of capitalism, it's important for us to define the term because there's many different ways that people try to use the term, and Marxists are going to say capitalism is the state acting and controlling businesses as well, and things like that. So I need to bring into view that definition from the libertarian vantage. And from that view, capitalism means free market capitalism. It's the idea that people can act in the market voluntarily, contracting with others, accumulating wealth through labor and trade, and that the means of production can be privately owned. That is, an individual can own a business, they can hire people in wages, someone who owns a house can lease that out, they can be a landlord, things like that. So it's important to contextualize that capitalism, that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about free market capitalism, not the state picking winners and losers, from the Marxists, that kind of thing. So the question then is okay, well, how is capitalism best defended? That idea of people being able to freely trade, accumulate wealth on a consensual basis. How does that get best defended? And I bring that from, my vantage of the libertarian voluntarist view, and specifically from my books. And those are as you can see here, we have that first one, Vision for a Libertarian Future, and then of course, last but not least, Philosophical Voluntarism. So I am developing these ideas specifically from my articulations. You might find that there's some crossovers with different authors and different ideas, but the way I encapsulate it, is going to be uniquely from that angle. So I'm not here to defend Rothbard's version of natural law or anything like that. This is specifically my articulations for my philosophical books in that development. So we have to get back now to the root. So what is libertarian voluntarism? With all those big words, taken together, it's a lot to digest. So libertarianism is the property rights ethic. It's the philosophy of property rights. It starts with this idea of self-ownership. So in libertarian terms, we understand that each person has a consciousness inside their mind, right? And we accept that because the very nature of thinking is in and of itself an act of conscious expression. If someone is reasoning through things, they're talking with you, they're using their mind to reason and to debate and argue, and that in and of itself is kind of someone signaling their existence. It'd be really weird for someone to yell at you and say, I don't exist, I don't have a consciousness, while themselves acting as if the other person exists and acting as if they exist to be listened to. Right? It would be a big performative contradiction for someone to say, I don't exist, I don't have consciousness, while trying to get you to talk to them and to believe them. So we take these types of, axioms, these kind of predicate ideas, and we establish them based on people's actions and these minimums of how people act and treat each other. So when we have this consciousness of the mind, we understand that it exerts signals on the body, right? And to exist means that people have to acquire things outside their body and add it to their body. After being born, you're going to need food and water in order to grow. And in order to continue to adulthood, you're going to need to continue that over time. And in fact, your body's going to take up space in what we know as physical, or what we perceive as physical reality. So if you're going to need, in order to exist as a person, food and air and water and space to be on, well, we can't develop an ethics system unless we say that those things are ethical to do. And that is to, have food, to have shelter, have water, and so on and so forth. Otherwise, you will just die. So when we develop the libertarian property rights theory, we have to take into account these predicates. Otherwise, we don't have any humans left with which to reason, because everyone's dead if you're not able to acquire and add to your body your property right, your first property right of self-ownership, water, food, and space to be on, and that kind of thing. So when we have that grounded, we sit there and say, okay, what if we're going to make human interactions peaceful, if we want to avoid people hurting each other, what are the core properties that are basically irresistible? In other words, you can't violate these ideas without having a performative, contradiction. So what happens there is we look at the nature of consent, right? So consent means that an individual wants something. If you don't want something, you obviously don't consent to it. And if you want something, that means that you're consenting to it. Kind of basic definitional things that we can take at the axiomatic level of definition. And so we look at consent here as a means for people to universally understand that that's how people signal what it is they do or don't want. And so we have, first and foremost, the bodily property right, where that is, that the first property concept for being able to see it and respect in terms of other people. We have the idea of consent, and each person doesn't want anyone having their body touched or invaded or hurt without their consent, right? Performatively, consent means you want something. So if someone stabs you and you didn't want that, you didn't consent to it. We can understand that. So when we're looking forward and saying, okay, how are we developing an ethical system at these kind of core minimums? That is where we're really developing the idea of voluntarism. So libertarianism is the property rights concept. Voluntarism is the consent ethic, and thinking about how is consent manifested? How do we make sure it's accurate? Who has the ability to consent? Who has the ability to, to say, okay, I can or cannot give access to a certain thing or property right? So how does this tie all to capitalism? Well, if we're talking about people interacting with each other in the market, and they're building and they're creating and they're trading, well, these concepts need to backdrop that if we want to say what is going to be ethical, acceptable versus what is not. And so libertarian voluntarists have this nice, clearly defined, formulated way of looking at both bodily property rights and outer property rights through this concept of homesteading. And as I talked about before, in order for your body to exist, you're going to have to take in air, you're going to have to take in food, you have to take in water, you're going to have to exist somewhere, you're going to take up space at the exclusion of others. So libertarians have said, this is the core fundamental property right. And then outside of that, there are means to ethically acquire further resources without hurting others. In other words, physically invading the physical bodies of others, and while also being able to manage and meter different disputes because of scarcity. And scarcity here, we're saying that there's specific physical objects, for example, this book, and this book that I'm holding in my hand specifically, it can't be held by another unless they try to pull it out of my hands, right? The scarce object, it has a conflict issue. In other words, not everybody in the world can have this book in their hands at the same time, because they would deprive me of it if they were to pull it out of my hands. So metering that scarcity and that conflict is what's necessary for us to have capitalism and free trade and people respecting each other when they make those trades, and not then going and forcefully taking back something after they made a trade. So now that we have this backdrop with libertarianism, voluntarism, the homesteading ethic is this idea that individuals can capture out of the state of nature physical scarce resources. So at a very basic primitive level, if someone is in an unowned forest, no one has done anything to develop it out of the state of nature, no one is building a house or has already built something there, has claimed it, an individual could either capture something, like they pull an apple from a tree and they make it theirs, or they could excavate minerals and take it out, make it theirs, or they could clear land out of the state of nature. They could literally go ahead and cut down shrubbery, clear the land, build a house on it. And through that act, homesteading has caused them to acquire, in terms of a social respect, those things. And fundamentally, when I say social respect, that is all of this, something that's positively adopted. All these ideas, that is these theory ideas, are things that people take on into their mind, and they learn, they develop, and they adopt, and they act on. Because none of this is self-executing. There's no such thing as a self-executing morality. If you go and, let's just say, you stab someone to death, you won't be immediately struck by lightning because of that. If you go and you try to take someone's money of their wallet, you're not going to suddenly have a meteor crash through and kill you because, oh, you weren't supposed to do that. So all these ideas are developed by the human mind. They're done through reason and observation, and then they are adopted psychologically. And the more people take into consideration these ideas, the libertarian voluntarism ideas, the more they're able to respect the body and property of others. And the further this goes, you get to a point, a theoretical point, obviously, but if nobody were to intentionally disrespect other people's bodies by physically invading or taking their property that they've homesteaded, then you would have total peace except for accidents. So when you look at these philosophical predicates and these core foundations, it really makes a nice encapsulation of what is the state of people's natural existence. Again, not an appeal to nature fallacy, but rather here's the physical limitations, understanding that. And then from there, developing a code of ethics that enables people to both protect their bodies and to freely trade with others in a way that respects both consent, which obviously we just talked about before. You cannot want your consent to be violated, right? You cannot want to be raped. That is a performative contradiction of words. So you can only meter these free market ideas through these avenues, through the predicate of property rights with self-ownership, outer body property rights, and consent if you want to have peaceable trade. That is another one person, another saying, okay, I want these apples and I'll give you this silver coin or these dollars, and we agree to trade. And then each of them understands that once it's been traded, both of them are going to respect the other's property right because they know it's no longer theirs. So if they respect that consensual transaction, they say, oh, this isn't mine. I don't have the right to touch this. And then socially, when people adopt that, they also respect and uphold those transactions and trades. So the social structure around that enables people to freely trade and know that those things are going to be respected. That is, that they can be reasonably safe and secure in knowing that if they've made a deal and both parties agreed, that others are generally not going to come in and suddenly deprive them of that physicality or invade their body or property. And when you have that social norm, even if there are some bad actors, they're such a minority that the overwhelming majority of the population wants to see justice brought for those who would violate body and property. And so all taken together, this really backdrops capitalism very nicely, because this philosophy of property rights and consent ethics taken together really enables people to maximize being able to voluntarily trade with others, not cause further conflict by infringing on the bodies, properties of others, and it enables people to really be stable in their wealth accumulation, which wealth, meaning here that they are having more material resources, they have more efficiencies in their ability to produce more. People can be stable in that, knowing that generally the population is willing to uphold those ideas. And that psychology is inescapable, because regardless of whether you have government or not, it doesn't really matter fundamentally, because if you don't have enough people who are willing to respect those ideas, then you're basically going to be out of luck anyway, because the majority of people would be then like a zombie population. Like imagine a zombie movie where everyone's just going crazy and trying to take from you. If people by and large don't have the capacity to respect property rights, well, that doesn't matter, because they'd be like a squirrel or a frog or whatever. They're going to go all over your house. They're going to poop on your car. They don't care. They have no material way and interest and ability to respect your property rights. So no matter what, we're inherently tied to these philosophical ideas being mainstream normed in order to even meaningfully affect capitalism and property rights. And if we culturally don't have that, then that's when you see the dial shift, and you see, whether it's privately and or through the government, people are deprived of their physical property, and they don't feel safe in those things, and they can't invest, and they can't build wealth, and they can't build businesses because the risk is too great, knowing that whatever they try to accumulate will be destroyed or taken from them. So that's why libertarian voluntarism is such an important philosophical backdropping to capitalism, because it fosters the social respect, and it also meters those lines of when you have respect or disrespect of consent with clearly defined terms in terms of the non-aggression principles, how that's encapsulated with self-ownership and not initiating physical force against the body or properties of others. And I know there's a lot more topics that could be fleshed out with that, with edge case and this or that, but that's kind of the core reasons why libertarian voluntarism is so powerful and important for people to have capitalism fostered at a maximum.
Thanks, Jack. So there's 3 definitions I want to see if we can agree on that I think are vital to this: ethics, rights, ownership. So I'm going to start off and say, and you tell me if you disagree, and I'm going to use ethics and morality synonymously. In the English language, they're basically synonyms, right? In other languages, there's a separation, I know, but in English, there's basically synonyms. So I would define ethics as a code of values that guide human behavior. In other words, I'm being told that my mic is way too quiet. Let me jack it up a little bit. Is that better? Can you hear me? Let me do this. Audio. All right. I hope it's better, Liquid Zulu. Thank you. So I'm going to define ethics as a code of values to guide human behavior. Importantly, it's not just in order to be an accurate or a correct ethical system, these values have to be objective. In other words, they have to be true. So if I'm going to say this is a list of things that you should do, they're imperatives. In order for it to be an appropriate ethical system, an objective ethical system, it's a code of values to guide human behavior, maybe even better said, a code of correct values to guide human behavior. Do you take any issue at all with my definition of ethics?
The second half. So the first half I agree on with you. That is that ethics are a code of behavior that people adopt. Okay. The second half is the objective truth in terms of oughts there, because when it comes to those things, my differentiation is that they're subjectively adopted because none of them are self-executing. So in other words, you can say, oh, this is the right thing to do, but there is nothing that will stop you automatically and objectively. You could say like it's going to happen empirically and consistently to stop you from the unethical behavior. Okay, so you don't believe in any objective ethic? In the way that you defined objective, which could you define that again, just to make sure? Because I'm not sure if you defined a code of ethics. A code of ethics is a code of values that guide human behavior. That's what ethics is. But within that framework, you can have an accurate code of ethics or an inaccurate code of ethics. I'll use deontological ethics, for instance, are incorrect, I would argue. Kantian's ethics are incorrect. Altruism is an incorrect ethic. Christianity offers an incorrect ethic. Now, we could, of course, debate each one of them. I'm only saying this to say that there is a difference between a correct code of ethics and an incorrect code of ethics. All of them would be various codes of ethics, but they're not all correct. There is a difference between correct and incorrect when it comes to right and wrong or human behavior. That would require first establishing what makes something correct, and that would be based on one's subjective articulations and individual claiming what is correct. Okay, so then your belief is that there is no objective ethic. There is no objective ethic by the definition of no ethic is self-executing. But that has nothing to do with whether it's objective or not, Jack, because nothing is self-executing. Could you define what objective is then? Objective in this context means a truth discoverable by the human mind. It's a relationship between the mind and reality. It's something that's true. For instance, through my senses, I'm perceiving that I'm having a discussion with Jack Lloyd. That's objectively true. It's a fact. It's a relationship between my mind and external reality. It's a truth identified by human consciousness. That's objective. Right. So when you say that, there's two parts there, and this is, I think, where I'd have a bigger difference of discussion here. So in terms of your perceptions, right, your perceptions are limited to what is your consciousness and your ability to know what it is that you are perceiving, in terms of accurate reality. Now, you could be, for all we know, in the matrix, and your body is somewhere else, and you're experiencing that reality in a different context. But without objective in terms of your own thing of saying, okay, I'm able to perceive and be able to test for yourself and prove repeatedly that is the case, there isn't really criteria for proof or disproof that is the case, that you're actually in the matrix and right now, you think you're here in physical reality, but your body's not. So that's why I take into consideration that fact that all these things are how we perceive them, how we reason with them. That's the best evidence for what we think we perceive, and we act on those things unless there is a better evidence that
Okay.
that is not what it is.
Okay,
And
so you would, just to be
Yeah.
clear then, so you would take an issue not just with objective values, but with the entire idea of objective truths.
So there's two types of things to think about when it comes to when you say objective truth. We can say that something could be metaphysically true, for example, and to give people a simple idea what the idea of saying, 1 + 1 is 2, right? Even though my two fingers here might represent those numbers, I could do it with a symbolic representation of books. 1 and 1 is 2. I could take, different shapes and have them represent those different 1 and 1 Roman numerals and have a different symbol make it 2. But you can understand those things irrespective of geography. In other words, someone can see that concept. They can understand the metaphysical truth of what they're perceiving. One place in Asia, another place, in Africa, another place in North America. They can all observe those metaphysical, empirical relationships. However, that you can observe those things doesn't necessarily say what the ultimate truth is behind that physical manifestation of where it is springing from, and it also, in and of itself, doesn't prove the causation relationships for is ought as relates to ethical behavior. You can
so
observe
hold on 1 second. I want to ask you a question.
What you should do, right?
Do you accept Hume's is ought gap?
Could you explain what you think about that so I can understand what you're talking
David
about?
Hume said there's no way to bridge, there's no way to derive or to get an ought from an is. So that there could be no objective morality because based on what is, there's no way to arrive at what you should do. So it sounds to me like what you're talking about is you believe ultimately that you're an epistemological skeptic, that you don't believe that we can ultimately have knowledge, that we have our subjective interpretations, but that's the best we can do.
Right. And that fundamentally is true because to have the ability to know, universal knowledge, that you have omniscience, you yourself would have to actually have all knowledge to be able to fact check every piece of information that exists potentially.
Okay.
So that's a limitation of human consciousness. Yeah.
Okay. So back to the definition of ethics, but you would agree that ethics is a code of values to guide human behavior. That
Absolutely.
You're okay with. Okay.
Yeah.
So a right is a just or a moral claim to something. That's straight out of the dictionary going back to at least Samuel Johnson.
Right. And I would say that is something that I agree to, and it's specifically, though, what backdrops that is it's human psychology. So when I talk about rights, I'm talking about the psychology of how people respond to actions and their judgments about whether they consider something right or wrong. And when I talk about that, I'm obviously going to be referencing libertarian voluntarism as that first right or wrong decider.
But you have no issue with my definition of rights that I'm employing.
No, in the broad abstract sense, definitely not. No.
Okay. And ownership basically just means your right to a specific thing. So if I own my book, you would say I have a moral or a just claim to this book. That's what ownership is, right? It's not something, what I mean is it's not something granted by government. It's not something enacted by legislative fiat. Although governments can come in and make laws pertaining to ownership and they can get it wrong, whatever. But ownership ultimately means I have a right to something, a moral claim to it.
More specifically, it's a bundle of psychological references. So ownership means that you are the person who's perceived to have the highest ability to hold on to and use or exclude from a physically scarce thing. You could destroy it. You could gift it. You could improve upon it, whatever it is. That is a human psychology that others have to respect for that to be something that's meaningful, because obviously you could say I own this book, but if someone comes in and they shoot me in the head and they take it, me saying, hey, but I own that book, well, I don't have it anymore. I would need others to basically validate that and to respect that ownership for it to have empirical weight. And on top of that, when it comes to the ownership psychology, that is something that is always tied to having multiple people. Because if you were the last person on earth and you said, well, I own this book, well, it's like, cool. Nobody is trying to take the book from you. You're the only human being on earth, and the animals can't respect property rights. They don't have any concept to be able to negotiate psychological respect.
You're absolutely, I don't have any issue with that. Yeah. All I want to establish is that the concept of a right is very integral to the concept of ownership.
Certainly, yeah. These language labels as defined, definitely.
Okay. This is why, now I'll make my case for why libertarian voluntarism, as you've laid it out, is not a good defense of capitalism. First and foremost, you're an epistemological subjectivist. If there's no objective truth, then anything I'm trying to convince somebody else of is just my opinion ultimately. There's no basis in reality for them to accept the truth of what I'm saying. So if I say libertarian voluntarism is the best system, what I'm in fact saying is, according to my subjective interpretation, libertarian voluntarism is the best system. There's no way to arrive at the objective truth of it. Secondly, if a right is a moral claim to something, it's a just claim. Right is a moral concept in and of itself. You can't start at right. You can't start at ownership, which is a right to something. You have to attach it to a broader ethical theory, which you haven't done. You started with self-ownership, and that's what virtually every libertarian argument does that's not a utilitarian. They start with ownership. There's no broader ethical philosophical system to attach it to. So if you don't have, one, an epistemological truth that you can appeal to, and if two, you don't have a broader ethical system, then your claim that you have a right, you have a self-ownership, a right to anything is completely baseless. It's not tied to anything. It's completely divorced from reality. That, my friend, in my view, is not an effective argument for capitalism.
Yeah, so when you're talking about this idea that you don't have an objective basis for which to do this, I think that what you're missing here in terms of what you're saying is that you're stating that this is objective, therefore it is self-executing. And I think that's the fallacy that underpins it, because you can say, I think this is objective, but that doesn't mean that you don't ever act in contradiction of it. It doesn't mean that other people, even if they hear it or see it, don't act in contradiction of it. You can say that, oh, maybe I see something, but it doesn't mean that you go and not only act on it, but that you also then adopt it. No matter what, you are actually in the business of arguing to others and convincing others of your ideas. And those ideas themselves are subjectively adopted because the information you presented is someone saying, I'm going to believe these things based on these predicate ideas you've told me, even though you fundamentally don't know the ultimate nature of existence, because you don't have universal consciousness, you're not omniscient, and we can prove that with a simple test of just any factoid that you don't know. And you also don't have the ability to sit there and objectively say, through cause and effect relationship, what is right or wrong, because you can murder and get away with it. You could steal from somebody and you can live your whole life and never have anything in particular happen to you. So these things, because they're both not self-executing and don't have a universal consciousness, all knowledge, omniscience backdrop, fundamentally mean that people are subjectively hearing what you have to say and then choosing whether to accept and adopt that and to live on that or not. And even if they say they accept it, they can act in contradiction of it, just like there's a division within objectivism, whether you're Atlas Sire on Ayn Rand Institute, whether it's all Ayn Rand's works, or you can expand past her works. There's debates and disagreements about, what is objective or what isn't. If you got all the people who are objectivists in the world, who think truth is objective in the world, in one room, and you said, hey, what are the 10 planks that are most important for objective reality, you're going to get people say, Allah is God, or Jesus is God, or this, or there is no God, and this. You're going to see a bunch of people who claim to be objective, who claim to have objective reality figured out, and they're going to list out their religious or a-religious ideas and say these are the real planks. And no matter what, the truth that comes out of that in terms of what is seen of that empirical reality is that people have their different ideas about what objective truth is, and they're arguing to others and trying to get others to believe in those things. They're psychologically presenting their ideas and trying to get people to adopt them and to live off them. But no matter what, it's never self-executing. You always have to act on it.
Okay, it doesn't have to be self-executing. There's a couple fallacies in what you stated. First off, you don't have to be omniscient in order to have knowledge. I don't need to know everything in order to know that I have this can in my hand. Right? That's the first thing. Secondly, the fact that people disagree over something is irrelevant to the truth of the proposition or the truth of the belief. People disagreed over whether the earth was round or the earth was flat. There's still an objective, knowable truth there. And the people don't need to be omniscient to know it. And so the fact that people disagree, that really doesn't matter. And if I'm arguing for ideas, but my ideas of necessity can't be known to be truth, then what the hell am I arguing about? What am I trying to convince people of? That my subjective perception is superior to theirs, but there's no way to ultimately know it. And then you said, well, you can prove this, but proof has to do with the gathering of evidence in support of a given conclusion. But in your frame, you can never have knowledge of a given conclusion, so you could never have proof. It's just not possible. And if you can't have that type of knowledge, you certainly can't have values. You definitely can't have rights. You could have agreement among people about, but even then you couldn't know that you had agreement because that would be subjective. So your entire argument is trapped in a subjectivist sort of web that it can't escape from. When any argument you make, whether it be about rights, ownership, capitalism, freedom, consciousness, psychology, whatever, you're involved in a self-negating statement because you've already said you can't know all these things because you're not omniscient.
Yeah, so when I say that it is subjective, that's recognizing human limitation. I don't find that to be a flaw of anything. It's actually recognizing what it is that humans are capable of understanding. Just like you held the can, if you were in the Matrix, like the movie everybody knows about, even though you think you're holding the can, you might not be. Now, am I saying, does that prove the other thing? No, you need proof as in reason, evidence, things that continue to show empirical reality, causal relationship that you're in the Matrix or not. But regardless, when you say, hey, I want to convince someone of my objective reality, the truth is that you're trying to get others to believe in your framing of what you are saying as a human being within the limitations of consciousness. You're trying to basically tell others from your subjective view what you think those right things are. And unless you're going to now claim that you are 100% correct in perceiving reality and that you hold all objective truth, then you have to admit that you have a human mind that is prone to potential error, which means that even though you do perceive some things maybe correctly in terms of it being factually true, it could ultimately be, it doesn't mean that necessarily that what you have perceived is the correct thing. And you're relegated fundamentally to trying to get other people to relate to your subjective experience. That's the whole talk of argument and people saying, hey, do you see this? I see this. Do you see this? I see this, right? You're constantly in a confirmation bias of trying to get other people to say, yeah, I agree with you and you agree with me. Yeah, we see these things. Now, again, you could have a group of people, as you noted before, who were wrong about that, whether it was something about, the Earth's motion or the shape. But that doesn't change the fact that because we have this weakness and because we have these infirmities in our ability to understand everything, that we don't sit there and say, we take the best of what we can perceive. That's what we're relying on, is our reason, our perceptions. And we do the best that we can to try to understand those things and look for cause and effect relationships and see how we would want to be treated. And that's why I go back to that consent ethic, because consent fundamentally by lingual action, performative action, cannot be desired to be violated. You can't want your consent violated. We could observe and think through and relate to people on those things. And inherently, there's going to be some people who either can't understand it because of mental deficiency or age, or they don't want to. They don't care. You can say truth is objective and you shouldn't do this. And they go and they murder and they steal anyway. Okay, cool. Well, it doesn't change anything. It's not, as I said, it's not self-executing. You're always stuck having to convince other people of your ideas. If you want them to have the idea and then manifest in physical reality the performance of those ideas. So that's what we do. We discuss them. We find ways to have it be more consistent and to avoid initiating physical force. We look at physical scarcity and empirical reality, and we sit there and say, okay, well, how do we negotiate these conflicts better? Because I subjectively don't want my body and property destroyed, and most everybody else doesn't either because they want their consent respected. And so that's why it works so well, because it avoids and sidesteps all the things that you have, whether it's from a religious or a religious perspective, where people are saying, well, is there ultimate truth from God or is there not? And if there is no God, is there even a truth? Forget it. You don't even need to go there, because you can sit and settle on the basics of what people experience and develop from there an idea about how to reduce those conflicts and to promote, as get back to the OP, capitalism. So no matter what, it's really something that you're in the business and process of communicating to others and hoping that they adopt, with no guarantee that they do.
Okay. You're involved in a serious contradiction, and this is it. On one hand, you've just laid out about a 5 to 7 minute rant of truth claims, claiming a lot of things are truth. On the other hand, you're saying that you can't know truth. The other problem you have is you're saying that because I could be wrong, or because I've been wrong, or because I don't know anything, that doesn't warrant saying I'm wrong in any specific case. That requires evidence, that requires proof. The problem is you're saying we can't rely on proof. When you say that this is all subjective, you're necessarily saying I can't know anything. So you can't know that I'm making an argument right now. You can't know that we're on X right now. You can't know that we're live streaming this. You can't know that objectivism is such a thing. You can't know that libertarianism is such a thing. You literally cannot know anything. So if you can't know anything, then how can you convince anybody of what you can't know?
I didn't say that you can't know anything. I said that the ultimate truth, the metaphysical truth of what is the nature of existence, is outside the purview of human mind limitation. You can know and observe certain things. You can see causal relationships. You can see that 1 + 1 = 2. You can talk to someone and you act as if they exist. And yourself, you also act as if you exist, as I said before, by performance of argument.
But that doesn't mean. But you're making truth claims, Jack.
Yes,
this is the whole thing.
Yeah, that's nothing wrong with saying that's an axiomatic thing that we accept.
How? How is it Jack? How could you ever know something was an axiom if you can't have knowledge? That's all dependent on the evidence of your senses, which you're saying that you can't trust.
No, I said you can have knowledge. I didn't say that you can't.
So I can know truth.
Okay, you can choose to trust all kinds of things and be wrong. You could say, I'm going to buy a product. I trust that this is going to work. And you take it home and it breaks. It doesn't mean your trust is not material to the empirical reality.
No. So now you've saying that then I can know things. I can know facts.
You have the ability in terms of how your action is perceived and how you sense things. It appears that you can take in information, reason that information, and make judgments. Those are things that we can observe about ourselves. It doesn't determine the ultimate locus of that. It doesn't determine anything.
That is a truth claim you just made.
Yeah, I made a truth claim.
Can you be absolutely certain about the argument you just made?
I can be absolutely certain about the fact that these experiences in terms of performance, that is the way that we are communicating right now, is a performative action that we both act as if we exist.
Well, yes. But how can you be sure that I exist?
I can only be sure if I had the omniscience to for sure know what your ultimate reality was.
Okay, so you would say then you cannot know that I or others actually exist.
Because I am not omniscient, I have a limitation on knowing ultimate truth. Yes, there's a limitation that I would have to admit.
Jack, that's not ultimate truth, Jack. Saying I exist is not the ultimate truth. It's just the truth. It's just a fact. I exist. I know I exist. I know you exist.
That's an assertion, but if you were in the Matrix and you were not,
there's no evidence I'm in the Matrix.
There isn't, but it's a possibility of theory, but you can't prove or disprove it. We just act as if it's
you don't have to. It's an arbitrary assertion. It's like Descartes' demon that's controlling everything. It's a completely arbitrary assertion for which there's no evidence. I don't need to make my arguments or live my life based on arbitrary assertions.
I didn't say to live your life based on anything in particular.
I would have to. If I couldn't know facts, if I couldn't know truth, then what is the basis for my living?
You can take in information, right, in terms of how you experience things. You, on your own, in your consciousness, you perceive, you take in information, and you act on that information. And you look for causal relationships. Sometimes your causal relationship analysis is wrong. You think that something's going to have a benefit, and it has a detriment. You think a relationship that you have is going to be good, it turns out bad. You can make mistakes, you have human error, and you act on those things, but just because you act on those things and you say, I'm assuming this is true, right? I assume I exist, right? I can assume it. I can't ultimately prove it with all knowledge in a religious context sense. You know, you can't say, well, God created you and you're going to be, born again one day, or you're going to be, a part of the larger, grander scale of the universe after you die because of, Buddhism or something like that. I can't prove or disprove those non-material things that theoretically could be true, but as you correctly state, and I agree with, the ability to say, here's the evidence, the cause and effect relationship to prove to ourselves, which we're in a constant state of doing, empirical proof, is just not there to be able to test and see and confirm. And that's that limitation. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with saying, okay, I have a limitation as a human, but I'm going to act as if I do exist. I'm going to act as if truth does have this causal relationship that I can perceive, while it's still admitting, okay, but fundamentally, I can't know the ultimate truth without that ultimate perception. Okay. And there's nothing wrong with admitting that deficiency. It's okay.
Okay. So we have to, what we're going to do now, and we didn't go over this ahead of time, so I'm going to run it by you, make sure it's okay.
Sure.
We're going to move to objectivism. I'd like to give my closing argument, maybe 2 minutes, and then because this is you're defending your proposition, you go last, give your closing argument, then we move to objectivism, and then we'll do the same thing. I'll give the first opening argument, and I'll give the last closing argument. Does that work for you?
Sure, totally fine.
Okay. So the reason I say that Jack's libertarian voluntarism ultimately fails and does not provide a convincing case for capitalism, first, because it can't even prove that capitalism exists. It can't even prove that people exist. It can't prove anything. So I don't know how you argue anything. Secondly, it starts with ownership. It starts with property. And it starts with rights. Rights ultimately are a moral concept. Without a broader ethical theory to attach them to, they're floating in the wind. They mean nothing. So your epistemological skepticism and you're starting in midstream on property rights ultimately negate the entire argument, and that's why it fails. Go ahead, Jack.
Sure. I mean, the core issue that you have is it's kind of like the God of the gaps argument that you're making, where you're basically saying, oh, okay, I'm going to make an objectivist statement about I have this ethical philosophy that underpins it, but where did that come from? You can keep going back, like who created God? No matter what, you're fundamentally always going to be asserting what you think your perceptions are accurately recording and digesting and using reason to produce in terms of an ethical theory. You're inherently tied to trying to convince people of these things. And even when you try to convince people of these things, there's no mandatory, automatic, self-executing consequence for violating those things. And on top of that, there is nothing that is going to automatically prove or disprove what you say about things, because as a human being, you can say words and those words don't even match reality. Like if I say, in terms of our perceived reality, if I say I'm a goldfish, well, I said the words I'm a goldfish, that doesn't make me a goldfish. If I say I'm a zebra, it doesn't make me a zebra. You can say words that are divorced from the empirical reality relation that you otherwise perceive or that others perceive. So fundamentally, we are tied to our senses. We are in a constant state of confirmation with each other. And no matter what, we are always trying to argue with others to get them to see our perspectives and to get them to say, okay, yes, I can understand this idea of self-ownership and respecting each other. And if we do that, okay, we won't have violence against each other because you won't disrupt my property and I won't disrupt yours, and we'll have peace and we'll be able to trade peacefully. And so recognizing those things and realizing that, okay, this is not self-executing. This isn't some magical thing that if you say, natural law or objectivism and suddenly everybody's like, whoa, we're suddenly respectful of property rights. We know perfectly how to implement them. It's just not true. You're always going to have to talk to others and flesh through these ideas and work through what it means to have consent if you wish to have greater respect of property, and within that, the scarcity issues as relates to people and their outward stuff. And that's okay. That's a wonderful thing for people to recognize that they have a subjective, selfish interest in preserving their body and their outer property, and to get them to say, okay, I'd like to meter that in a way where I reduce conflict over scarce resources. It's a relatable thing. And for those who can't relate, it doesn't matter. They're going to act outside of it anyway. They're going to murder, they're going to rape, they're going to steal. And if they're too young to understand it, or if they're an animal, okay, well, you can't change that. You can only get as many people as you can to come into the view and to agree with the view of respecting those things. And when you do that, and you convince people of those ideas, you do see a manifest reality of property rights leading to prosperity, which is, of course, what is free market capitalism, which moves us out of the dark ages of feudalism and kings and people being, totally impoverished through having their stuff taken, and mercantilism, and moves us into maximizing consent, minimizing the initiation of force, building a wonderful, beautiful future for people to enjoy because they're not hurting each other and they're not setting each other into uncertainty that they can't build for the future because what they have is going to be taken from them or disrupted. And that's wonderful. That's just a part of people relating to each other and understanding that regardless of their religious background or a religious background, it doesn't matter. It transcends those things. And that is what's powerful about it.
Okay. Thanks, Jack. Now for why I say objectivism offers the best defense of capitalism out of any, or a better defense of capitalism rather than any variant of libertarianism. So the objectivist political view, it's all about rights, individual rights. A right is a sanction of sanctions your freedom of action in social situations, right? The first right would be your right to life. I have the right to take the necessary actions to protect my life, to sustain my life. This means earning, creating property, doing that with it, which I want. It means making my own choices so long as I don't violate the rights of others. And ultimately, within that context, you end up with human beings creating, trading with each other. We have capitalism. And we have capitalism because each individual can own things, trade them, and be free to do what they want with them. But objectivism doesn't start there. Objectivism starts way back at metaphysics with the fact that external reality, metaphysical reality exists. It exists independent of human beings. And that the purpose of the human mind is not to create reality, but to perceive it. And we learn about reality by means of reason. And we reason, we start our I don't know if I want to say starting point, but all of knowledge is ultimately can be traced back to the three fundamental axioms of existence, identity, and consciousness. These things necessarily are real. They will be implicit in any statement that we ever make. Objectivism then goes on to an ethical system. Now, we don't have time to get into the entire ethical system of objectivism. The only relevant point really here is that our theory of rights, meaning a moral claim to something, is directly connected to our theory of ethics. Because as I said before, you cannot have a theory of rights unless you have a theory of ethics. The objectivist ethics, it begins with the observation that human beings have free will and that we don't come equipped knowing what we have to do. We have to learn it. We also know that there's things in life that are destructive of life, that will kill us. And given that the only alternative, only fundamental alternative in this universe is existence or non-existence. And it only applies to living entities, and human beings have to make the right choices if they wish to exist. This gives rise to the concept of morality, because we have to pursue values. A value is something, it presupposes the question of value to whom and for what. And given that I have to choose my values to act, we have ethics. So within that scope, we end up coming to the conclusion that human beings, our fundamental means of survival is reason. We have to use reason to survive. That provides us with an ethic of rational self-interest. And given that I uphold my right to act in my own interest, I respect the right of you to act in your own interest. I understand that it's wrong for me to initiate force against others. And importantly, I understand that if somebody else initiates force against me, I have the right to retaliate. I have the right to defend myself. And I also have the right to defend others. And that's where we get to the moral claim to something. The moral claim to my life is the starting point. I have to have a moral claim to that which makes morality possible, which is my own life. But here's the thing with objectivism. I mean, that's all very technical language that I just used, and you know, it is live. I'm sure I forgot something. Hell, I might have even misstated something. But the bottom line is this: objectivism offers a moral vision of rational self-interest, of human beings doing what's best for themselves. That leads us to admire the morality in others. So we admire people that succeed. We admire entrepreneurs, capitalists, people that put in the effort to make themselves better. And also we admire ourselves for doing it. So we have the moral fuel to make a capitalist system work. What we offer is optimism, growth, life, everything that life has to offer, all the things that libertarianism simply doesn't offer. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Jack.
Sure. And I mean, I like a lot of, the thinking through the rational things and how in terms of identity and existence. I think we agree on those things in terms of those are accepted axioms. I think that for me, that's what I was trying to relate before in terms of we act as if those things are true. And we assert those, okay, well, we're going to live as if this is true. That's how we perform what we do. But the thing where it gets a little dicey is the self-interest and best, right? Because now we're getting into subjective value. And with subjective value about what's best or not best, an individual could be like, well, it's best for me to mass murder 80 million people. I get to be king. I suppress everybody else. And I, have the chance to plunder and live off of it, whether I'm Mao or Pol Pot or Stalin, right? For them, their subjective self-interest best may be mass murder, and they get to live the high hog, and they get to, basically have everything aggregated to themselves and have people just be their servants. So when we say self-interest and we say best interest, these are subjective values that get, really dicey. We're saying, okay, this is what you live by. So what I counter to this in terms of, where there's a difference here is that libertarian voluntarism specifically stands against acting on those things that violate the body and property of others, even if someone would have a net material benefit to themselves just because they get away with it, whether it's some robber who kills an old man and that old man has no living relatives. He was living out his last days and they steal his money and jewelry and they flee to Mexico and they're there seeing strippers. I don't know, whatever it is. If they think that's in their best interest, okay, well, they get away with it and now they're living better. See, they're acting their self-interest. Libertarians reject that. They say, no, even if you think you could be better off by violating the body and properties of others, that goes against these core ethics. And we don't want to have those things, that is those who have adopted the psychology, because the more people try and think that they can get away with stealing and murder, this, that, the more suffering they cause for others. And it's a very relatable concept because most people already understand and relate to, I don't want myself to be hurt. I don't want to be stolen from. I don't want someone thinking, oh, if I can get away with it, I'm going to go rob them or murder them in the middle of the night and take their things. So that is really a big difference there, where it's taking a specific stand against that and not getting lost in the abstraction of self-interest that might be hand waved away and say, well, maybe it's not in the self-interest and the consequences of this, that, because someone murders or rapes, maybe society, will have justice through the government, this, that. It's just immaterial. It actually doesn't speak to the ethical, inputs and outputs. It just is wishfully hoping, well, there'll be justice maybe. So libertarians sidestep all that and say, hey, no, this is unethical, regardless of whether you think that you're going to be benefited in net at the expense of the body and property rights, out of property rights of another person. So, to me, that's so critical, especially if you want to have people embrace capitalism, that, okay, they're going to respect body and property. They're going to honor their trades. They're going to honor their contracts. They're going to honor their agreements. They're not going to, go and try to steal back from you after they've, traded voluntarily. So I think that is really important as a psychology to adopt. And again, it's not self-enacting. None of what I'm saying is self-enacting either. It always has to be people saying, I want to live based on these values and live it out with my actions. No matter what, you always need people to hear, process, and adopt and live out on whatever ideology it is, whether it's, religious or philosophical. It's people having to adopt and having to act. So that's what I lay out and say, this is what to agree on in ethics if you're looking to have that consent respect, those minimum standards of consent respect.
Okay. So first, the idea that it's subjective about what's best for somebody or not. If I'm standing on the roof of a building with somebody else and that person says, I know I can jump off this building, land on my head, get up and walk away. And I say, no, you cannot. There's an objective truth there. It's not subjective. There's a reality there that confronts us both. The same thing applies to whether it's healthy food, relationships, whatever. Some things are more difficult to discover whether it's good or bad for you, but nonetheless, there's still an objective truth about what's good or bad for you. Secondly, the idea that it's in your self-interest to commit robbery or murder or anything else, objectivism spends a lot of time discussing the evil of the initiation of force. The non-aggression principle is largely, if not entirely, derived from Ayn Rand's idea that the initiation of force is evil. Justice, independence, rationality, productivity, these are the virtues of objectivism. They all conflict with the idea of initiating force against somebody else. No objectivist on this planet, if he's in his right mind, is making the argument that he could go and rob and rape and pillage. I mean, that is the Nietzschean egoism at its worst, what you're talking about there. It's certainly not objectivism.
So just two things I want to address something you said at the beginning as well. When you said an individual jumping off a building and harm, subjectively, a person may want to end their life because they're in pain. They have a terminal cancer and they're just like, I want to be done with it. That may physically harm their body, but subjectively, they value ending their life more than staying alive and being in pain. That's an example of how subjective values are different, even if it may seem this is physically detrimental. Just like a mother may jump out in front of a car to save her child who's ran to the street. Yes, physically, it may be a detriment to her body, but she values protecting the life of her child more than the harm to her body. So we can sit there and say, okay, yes, there are things that maybe we can observe in empirical reality, say, okay, this is going to cause and affect a certain harm to a certain part. But the subjective value of whether any person wants to have harm to their body or not is wholly subjectively dependent on their personal goals and objectives. And then on top of the discussion where you're talking about what Ayn Rand's self-interest is. I mean, yes, she herself can say, well, I think these things are bad. And that's an assertion. Okay, they're bad. Why? Ayn Rand said so. Okay, where did Ayn Rand get that from? Well, she just said it's bad because, maybe it hurts people and you'll feel bad, or maybe there'll be some bad consequences, or whatever it is. It just doesn't matter because fundamentally it's just her making an assertion that she wants people to believe that it's bad. But if empirically an individual says, oh yeah, I can mass murder, be a king and rule and reign, I'm going to die after a long life and have a bunch of concubines, they do it. They just are, the history of humanity is quite violent with lots of governments. So it's not really something that's like, has this ever happened? So we know empirically, objectively, in terms of your own terms, using those terms, that if you believe that you can observe history and look at the records and look at these things and say, okay, well, the kings of the past were pretty violent and they got away with it. Okay, well, there you go. They're acting in their interest personally, and they're expressing themselves as being wanting to be a ruler, wanting to pillage, and wanting to basically enrich themselves from the suffering and destruction of others. So it's insufficient just to assert you shouldn't do this in terms of ethics. You have to say, hey, this is something that you want to adopt. This is something that if you actually value consent and want to have that reciprocity, this is something that you want to adopt for the sake of your own self-preservation, despite the fact that there may be some people who don't care, because there are always going to be people who are like, even if they know that, this is something that's going to hurt a person, they know that they're causing pain and suffering, they do it anyway. They're rapists, they're muggers, robbers, murderers, and often governments at large with, 20th century democide with having some of the greatest mass murders. So fundamentally, you're always going to be coming back to needing to teach people these ideas and convince them to accept these ideas and to live out these ideas. Because no matter what, whether you call it objectivism and whatever flavor of that, whether you call it Christianity, whether you call it this, you can label things whatever way you want. No matter what, people have to have a thinking process that gets them to say, okay, I'm rejecting violating consent of others and initiating physical force into their body or outer property. And if you don't have that, the more you have that cultural disrespect, the more that you have a very violent demographic or society or whatever you want to say, group of people in an area, because they're constantly initiating physical force against others. They're constantly, swindling others or robbing people, and no one is safe and no one is secure and no one can build because they're constantly worried that anything they accumulate is going to get taken, whether it's by private pillagers or state authorized pillaging. So, that's really what it comes down to for me when we're thinking about the application of those things.
Okay. So you're using the very fact that gives rise to the need for morality as your argument for why there is no objective morality. And that's the fact that people can choose differently. People can believe differently. It's the very fact that people choose and can choose and have to choose that gives rise to the need for ethics to begin with. The other thing is you're battling a straw man. For you to say, well, because Rand just says, well, this is wrong or right because I say so, that's just not true. She lays out a meticulous argument over the course of numerous books and numerous speeches and whatnot. Plus, Leonard Peikoff, her intellectual heir, wrote an entire treatise and has given dozens of lectures on the subject. It's not just a matter of saying so. I mean, obviously, I can't go over what they took years to do in a 45-minute debate, but that's just a straw man. But the biggest problem here is that on one hand, this all goes back, and now I really, and I've thought this for a while when discussing with libertarians, it all comes back to epistemology. Because on one hand, you're saying we can't know, but on the other hand, you're saying you do know, and how can I ever argue against that? Any assertion that I make, anything that I attempt to prove, you come back and say, but it all boils down to everything's subjective, but then you lay out truth claims. So somebody in the comments feels like I should lay out, it says Rand versus Mises on subjective objective value. I don't really know. I can do it. I don't know what the relevance is here, but Mises, of course, taught that all value is subjective. There's no right and wrong. Rand disagreed. In economics, it's true that the subjective valuations of individuals is what gives rise to prices, but that has nothing to do with whether the things are actually good or bad. Now, you gave an example. You actually countered my example where the guy jumps off the roof and lands on his head. And you said all that can show is that it harms his body. But there's a couple points here. One is the disagreement I proposed is that one person says he can do it and be just fine. And then you switched it and said the person's suicidal. But if a person is suicidal, then we'd have to measure the facts of that case to see if his suicidal ideation is justified. And then it would still be an objective fact whether or not this jumping off the roof is good or bad for him. We can't always know all the facts dealing with every person in every situation, but that person still has to analyze the facts of reality in order to act effectively in this world. And another thing is you yourself agreed that ethics is a code of values that people live by, not die by. So if you're going to live by a code of values, then to say we're going to negate life, well, then you're negating ethics altogether and you're out of the sphere of moral discussion. But the most important thing here, I think, is that the libertarianism that you're espousing is based on a subjectivist epistemology. Then it postulates an ethic of property rights without tying it to a broader moral theory, which is what it would have to do, whereas objectivists offer an objective epistemology, an objective code of ethics that leads directly to an objective theory of property and of individual rights, starting with the right to life onto property rights. And most importantly, or not most importantly, but a big part of it is it offers a moral vision and the inspiration for people to want to live in a capitalist society and be in a capitalist society. What it does is offers a defense of capitalism logically based on the fact of individual rights, but it also offers the motivational fuel to live in there and to succeed in there, in that society.
Well, just two things, because I like the jumping off the building one. That was fun. Yeah, they say I'll be just fine because they want to end their pain and suffering. And what happened after that is you went to a central planning mindset. You went to this idea that you know what's best for that person. And objectively, I think that I know what's best for you. And by your own logic, if you could objectively think what is best for an individual, then you've just basically admitted that you think central planning is actually doable because there's an objective truth about what centrally is able to plan for individuals' lives and what their subjective value should be, which is a very dicey thing to have just said. Then beyond that, the stuff with Ayn Rand and her defenses, I've read that stuff. It's not material because at the end of the day, when you say, okay, here's my reasoning, none of it's self-executing. You can always say words. I could say I'm a salad. Okay, cool. I'm objectively a salad. Cool, you could say it 100 times. It's not self-executing. There is no thing that makes me a salad because I say words. There's no thing that makes it objective because you say, I'm really objective. You can say it again and again. It has no empirical bearing. What does have empirical bearing, though, is cause and effect relationship, right? For example, if I take this and I move it to the other hand, you see it move across, right? That's cause and effect relationship.
How do you know I see that? Hold on. How do you know I see that?
Because you said you see me on the screen.
How do you know I said I see you on the screen?
Because I assume it to be the case.
So you assume it, you don't know it. Okay, so your entire and this is my point, is that the entire argument is based on your assumptions.
Of course.
That you're admitting our assumptions. But the idea, first of all, I said readily that we can't always know what's good or bad for somebody else because we don't know all the facts all the time related to that person. So that was another straw man you put up there. Secondly, even if we did, the idea that knowing what somebody should do transfers in, I have the right to make them do it, is silly. I know plenty of people that are drug addicts, alcoholics. I know that stuff's wrecking their lives. Hell, most of them would admit it's wrecking their lives. I also know that it's not my business to use force to stop them from doing those things, because the greatest evil in objectivism is initiating force against somebody else. So whether they're making the right decisions or wrong decisions, as long as they're not initiating force against others, as long as they're not violating the rights of others, I have no business touching them. Now, every single word I just said in objectivism is objectively true. It's verifiable by different people. So you can discover it, but just as anything in reality, somebody can be wrong about it. You're right. You have to convince people of it, but so what? You have to convince people of your theory too. So what difference does that make to the argument? Nothing. But again, it is readily apparent to me now that this all ties back to a subjectivist epistemology. And once you say you have a subjectivist epistemology, everything else crumbles. Everything. There's no assertions that you can make that could be objectively true. Nobody could know it.
I think you're making a fallacious connection here between saying that, hey, you don't ultimately know ultimate truth about something. In other words, you don't know the universal construct of something is happening.
But nobody claimed whether or not Jack.
That you all I said was that you assume it to be true and you act on it as if it is true. So I think someone in the comments here is getting it. They said he's arguing subjectivist epistemology, but he's also calling observed facts reality, which is objective. So they got it. They actually get that. What I'm saying is that there is a bridge between both.
Jack, what he's saying is you're contradicting yourself.
No, I'm not contradicting. I'm not contradicting.
Yes, you are.
No, I'm actually showcasing that human beings have limitations. They act on
but we know
what they perceive as reality. They act on what they believe is information and the reason, and then they process that and they look for cause and effect relationships. Does that prove the ultimate nature of reality? No, it didn't prove or disprove whether you're literally a conscious race or anything else. It does when you're talking about where do these ethics come from. Because you don't know, if you don't know what the ultimate nature of reality is, if your perceptions are one thing, but the truth of what you're doing is another, well, then it doesn't matter that you say, well, this is objectively true. You're false. You're in falsehood because your perceptions are not in alignment with reality. So all I'm saying there is that we have these limitations and we do our best that we possibly can to try to look for truth and to see cause and effects relationships. We're in a constant state of debating with each other, observing and testing and confirming and saying, did you see that? Did I see that? Did this work for you? Did that restaurant have a good review? We're constantly trying to relate to each other with our reason or consciousness. What I have done in terms of these things is I bridged what was Ayn Rand's rationalism in terms of her, having objectivism and trying to focus on reason.
Time out. Ayn Rand was not a rationalist. Not even close.
Sorry for the loose use of the word. Using reason and being rational. Okay. So let me rephrase that instead of the ism. So being specific, she was focused on the nature of, as you've correctly said, taking in perceptions, reasoning through those things, right? Understanding precepts and what those things, relate to in terms of empirical reality, cause and effect relationship. I agree with her on those things. And that's where my focus is in terms of saying we assume those things. That's really the core difference, is that we don't have ultimate truth knowledge, but because of our observations, our ability to test and to see cause and effect relationships, we do act as if those things are true. We act as if we exist. We act as if our actions can have material effect in empirical reality. We act as if other people matter. And we do that performatively by arguing with them, just like we're doing right now. So that's all I've bridged, is I've dealt with the fact that there is a backdrop of not understanding what ultimate consciousness and truth is, because obviously, unless you're literally omniscient to know every single thing in the universe and to be absolutely sure this is what is, you have that deficiency. But even though there's a deficiency, we could say we take the best of what we observe, we use our faculties, we take that in, and we look to see the nature of human action. And we see how people have limitations in scarcity, how they act with each other in terms of consent, and we're able to build an ethical framework, in other words, a way for people to act on that premise because we accept those things. And I think that if you see that, you'll see that we actually probably agree at a root in terms of where we start when it comes to reason and physicality. It's just that I also happen to leave in there is technically a black box behind it, but we still act as if, empirical reality matters and that physical reality, is perceived.
So I think it's a good place for us to give our closing arguments. But before we do that, I've recalled to Stephen Hicks's book, Explaining Postmodernism, where he talks about in an argument with a postmodernist that while you're making the argument, the person will often say, it's all just a matter of opinion anyway. And then you end up having to argue epistemology. So you and I start off, we're going to argue about what makes the best defense for capitalism. You make a case, but at the same time, you undercut the case by saying we can't know things. And you're saying because we can't know an ultimate reality, we can't know anything. Therefore, any positive assertions I make are then dismissed based on the subjectivist epistemology. But the sleight of hand here is that if that's the case, then everything you say also gets dismissed. Fortunately, there is an objective, there is a reality existing independently of humans. We can know that reality, even if I can't know everything about it, I still can know what I know. And that's where the gist of this disagreement is. It has to do with epistemology. But I want to wrap this up. Jack, you give your closing, I'll give my closing, and then we'll move on. And then maybe I'll have you on to argue about something else. Fine.
Well, no, I appreciate that. And I appreciate you hearing me out on that aspect. Fundamentally, I don't see what I'm saying here is contradictory. It's just admitting the human limitation. And that when we start at where we both actually kind of begin our agreements, we're actually in very strong alignment going forward, because both of us do accept that we appear to exist in physical reality. We accept that we process things by taking information through our senses and our mind. We use reason to discover causal relationships, input and output, cause and effect. So we both agree with these things, and we both say, yeah, people should value that as a means to determining cause and effect relationships and to understanding how they could develop ethics. I just say that fundamentally, when it comes to developing these ethics, we are doing that each on our own subjective abilities and wills. We are thinking through information, we're processing it, we're arguing with others, we're understanding and thinking through and philosophizing about what it means to have consent, the boundaries of property rights, and what is necessary essentially to reduce those conflicts over scarce resources. And by doing so, enabling capitalism, because people then are secure in their property, they're secure in their body, they can freely trade, and they know that culturally, socially, people are going to respect that by and large. And even if there's some who don't, there are means to stop or bring justice for those things, because the overwhelming majority of the population is in favor of that. And if you don't have that, regardless of any ism or any government or this or that, if your population doesn't respect property rights, empirically, you're in trouble anyway, because people are going to be stealing from you like it's a zombie apocalypse. And the government's going to be pillaging you like many despotic regimes have. So we're in the business of teaching others these principles and these ideas and getting them to adopt that, because we have observable peace when people act on that. And we don't want them to deviate from it, because if they do, that is literally a threat to everybody. When someone's like, yeah, I don't care about you, I'll rape you, I'll murder you, I'll take your stuff, and I'm going to, abscond somewhere else. So we all agree, that is those of us who have the ability to perceive, reason, think through these things and value these things, that a peaceful, prosperous future that enables both freedom and the ability to grow wealth and prosperity and to build for the future requires the respect of those ideas, consent, property rights. And so, I would say, by and large, me and you agree on pretty much most all of those things, I would say. I don't think that we have any material disagreement. It's just that I have a little addition to that I intentionally noted in my works, because there's so many who have those types of backdrops of mystical thinking, or just questioning the possibilities of what could be in the universe or multiverse or whatever, that there could be something else, but unless there's reason evidence for it, as I talked about from the beginning, unless there's something that we can show and prove to ourselves and really live out and live on, we don't assume those things to be true. We don't assume ourselves to be in the matrix, even though maybe it could be, but we don't assume it. We assume that which we act upon performatively in physical reality. We act as if we exist. To think is itself to be like, oh, I have a consciousness with which to think. And we use our minds to then determine as best we can with our limited faculties and our minds prone to human error. We do our best to try to discern principles and properties of what we experience. And I think that valuing reason, valuing that way of thinking is so important to protecting ourselves in terms of property rights and liberty and prosperity and capitalism. So I would imagine we definitely agree there, valuing reason and evidence as the means to really figure out these causal relationships and really helping people understand and relate to each other better with their subjective values.
Thank you, Jack. And the reason that I say objectivism is superior to libertarian voluntarism, as Jack has put forth when it comes to arguing for capitalism, is first, epistemologically, objectivism offers an objective epistemology by which we can know reality. Secondly, whereas in libertarian voluntarism, you start with property rights completely divorced from a broader ethical theory, which rights require, objectivism offers a full system of ethics that's then tied to the broader philosophical system of objectivism. So it all forms a whole that we can put forward to when we're arguing for capitalism. But more to the point, to the really flesh and blood of the things, is that objectivism offers a moral vision. It offers an inspiration to people to want to live free, to want to excel, to want to achieve all the things that make a capitalist society work. So while we do defend individual rights, absolutely, while we absolutely say initiating force is wrong, we promote human beings as beings that are capable of achieving greatness and ought to achieve greatness. And when they do achieve greatness, we should absolutely admire them. So with that, we'll wrap up the debate, and I want to give Jack a chance to hawk his wares. Jack, give us a shameful plug here, or a shameless plug of some books.
I do a lot of stuff. Obviously, I talked about my books here, where I do talk about the theorizing and the philosophy that underpins this more. I know that we didn't go through all those things, but I do flesh out a lot of these ideas even in greater detail, and push back against other ideas as well, in terms of the constructs that are trying to control people. So you could definitely check out my books there: Libertarian Voluntarism, A Vision for a Libertarian Future, and Philosophical Voluntarism here. I also do produce a comic series, Voluntarist, the comic series, which is super cool. So it's a liberty-oriented series that, basically revolves around the question of what does it mean to be truly free. So we have this trade paperback of it, pretty big. It's 192 pages, and we have a new ARC series. We actually just funded on that, and a new comic series. And I also have our kids series here, The Unschooled Adventures of Jack and Pho. So I have that book series as well. I mean, we do a bunch of different things. Me and my wife, we do all kinds of educational videos and music videos. We really do so many things. It's kind of overwhelming, but it's a good start. You can check out, jackvloyd.com to kind of see all those different creative ways to promote liberty. So
awesome, Jack. Thank you so much for coming on. I'll definitely have you on again. I'm going to get this up on YouTube in a few days. Thank you everybody for watching and taking part. For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Leibowitz. Till next time. Did it end? Okay.